What am I doing here? What's my purpose? Why am I here? And there's a lot of different answers to this question. But what is that greater purpose? Now, if we look at the Quran and we look at what is it that Allah says, what is it that God gives us as our highest purpose? Now, each and every one of you have a purpose. I'll call this the lowercase p purpose, right? We all have purposes that we live for in life, right? We have a lot of doctors, I heard, yeah? We have teachers, we have lawyers, we have mothers, fathers. There's a lot of different roles that we play. But that's not what I'm asking just for a moment. I'm asking, what is the purpose, capital P? Why am I actually here? And to answer this question, actually, God is very clear in the Quran. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has actually given us the answer to this question very clearly in the Quran. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ. I'm going to stop for a second. In the Quran, and actually the comedian that came before me gave a little bit of an introduction with la 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 la. But this construction of la ilaha illallah, it's a construction in Arabic where it begins with a negation. In other words, you negate any other purpose. So it's almost like taking a slate and wiping it clean. All right? So for example, la ilaha illallah linguistically is actually saying there is no ilah, there is no object of worship, or as the brother said, God, small letter G. There is none. So you begin with a negation, and so you have a clean slate. Why is this construction used? The reason is to give exclusivity. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? So that you say there is no other purpose, or there is no other God, in order to say illa, and then you add except. Now what that does in the Arabic language is it tells you that this is the exclusive answer to the question. So in this case, la ilaha illallah is that there's nothing worthy of worship. And if you stop there, that's atheism, isn't it? Right? There's no God. La ilaha, the first half is atheism. There's no ilah. There's no God. But Islam is to add the second half, which is very important, illallah, except for God. So in other words, there is nothing worthy of being my object of worship. And ilah in the Arabic language is a very deep concept, by the way. Ilah isn't just something you pray to. Ilah isn't just like a stone idol. And ilah, and I'm gonna tell you this, even an atheist has an ilah. You're gonna be like, what? Even an atheist has an ilah. Even an agnostic has an ilah. Even someone who says, I don't believe in God, has an ilah. Meaning, they have something that they worship. Something that they put at the center of their existence. Something that they put at the center of their hearts. Something they put at the center of their lives. Something they live for. And something they're willing to die for. That's an ilah. And so what makes a Muslim is to say that there's nothing worthy of being at that position except for God. It is pure monotheism. Pure in Arabic tawheed. So that's la ilaha illallah. But now where does the other ayah come in? وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ. This is the ayah about purpose. Capital P. Again, each and every one of us have lesser purposes, but this is ultimate purpose. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we have not created jinn and human beings for any other purpose, in parentheses. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ. We have not created them for any other purpose, illa, again, you hear that illa, except, so this is that exclusivity of purpose. Illa liya'budun. Except, now, here's another very deep concept, ubudiyya. The concept of ubudiyya, which means, loosely translated, worship. But the concept of ubudiyya in Islam is not just praying and fasting. Worship is not just what you do in the mosque. But worship can also be time that you spend with your family. Worship can also be time that you give to your community. Worship can be teaching. Worship can be even that intimacy between a husband and wife is actually an act of worship, as the Prophet ﷺ said. So worship is it's a comprehensive concept in Islam. But what is God telling us? He's telling us that the only purpose that we were created for, and there's no other, is to worship God. Now, what does it mean to truly worship God? It means essentially to put Allah or God. You know, one of the funny things is, I remember like a long time ago, there was like this award ceremony, and this celebrity stands up and was like trying to be really like open and inclusive. So he goes, whether you believe in God or Allah, that's the point, is they think it's two different things. God is Allah. When we say La ilaha illallah, we're not saying that our God is the only God or our Muslim God. We're saying the God of all people is the only thing worthy of our ultimate love and worship. And so when we give purpose to the next generation, see, because the problem is we live in a society right now that worships a lot of other things. We worship a lot of things in our society. And in fact, we are bombarded with things to worship. And I'm not talking here about Jesus. I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about materialism. I'm telling you that we are actually living in a society that teaches us and actually bombards us with the worship of money, with the worship of status, with the worship of power. These are the things we actually worship. We don't worship these religious symbols anymore. This is actually what our children are, and us, are dealing with. That this is the type of worship that we're being told to be involved in. And that is that take your money as your Lord, or take your status as your Lord, or take power. There are a lot of people who worship power. If you look at the crimes that are being committed at the highest level to the lowest level in the world, and you look at why, you'll find that that's what it's about. It's about the worship of power and the worship of money. And so these are objects of worship. Now, how do we come back to our ultimate purpose? Our ultimate purpose is to realize that our being created was for this one purpose, and that is to know, love, worship God. And I think that this is the first goal that I see, and as a litmus test, are we doing our job right in Islamic education? Have we given that higher purpose? It isn't only about learning haram and halal. See, the problem is, I think, that a lot of Islamic education across the board kind of goes wrong in this department, is that we tend, when we come to Islamic studies, we tend to teach Islam as a list of harams and halals, right? As a list of do's and don'ts. It's haram to eat this, it's halal to eat this, it's haram to wear this, and it's halal to wear this. And that's sort of what Islam becomes boiled down to. And that's a big problem, because ultimately, we have to be able to teach our children a higher purpose, to give them perspective. What are they doing here? And then how are they going to be able to live in this materialistic society without worshiping materialism, without worshiping that money? Yes, be doctors. Yes, be lawyers. Yes, be teachers. Have your endeavors in this life, but be careful not to worship it. Because the moment that you worship it, that's when you drown in it. You know, there's this really beautiful analogy. I write about it in my book, Reclaim Your Heart. There's a really beautiful analogy that one of the scholars gave about Duniya. Now, what is Duniya? And this brings me to my second point of one of the goals of Islamic education. And I think that one of the goals of Islamic education needs to be giving children the tools to master the dunya. To master the dunya. How many people have seen The Matrix? Like 2 people? Okay, anyway. Basically, mastering the dunya is realizing that this life, knowing it for what it is, and not allowing it to own you. This is very important. And so the analogy that he gives is that this life is like an ocean. Now, if you think about an ocean, what's the purpose of an ocean? Well, if you're traveling on the ocean, what are you going to use to travel on the ocean? A boat. Great. Okay. You guys are awake, right? You use a boat, right? So you use a boat to travel from point A to point B on an ocean. So he gives the analogy that this life, dunya, is like an ocean. Now the thing about an ocean is it's really beautiful from the shore, right? We can appreciate an ocean. It's really beautiful from the boat, right? Yes? But what happens when you allow the ocean to enter the boat? Anyone heard of the Titanic? It sinks. Brilliant. So what he explains is that the believer, or the human being, in fact, in this life is like a person, is like a boat in the ocean. And the boat is like the heart. So the heart in this life is like that boat in the ocean. The problem is, as long as you keep the water outside of the boat, it stays afloat. You feel me? You will be able to survive the ocean and even use the ocean, right? We get food from the ocean. We use the ocean for travel. But the ocean can also swallow you up, can it? If you allow the ocean to enter your boat, in this analogy, it's the heart. If you allow the ocean to enter the boat, that's when it owns the boat, and that's when it breaks the boat, and that's when it can consume the boat and drown the boat. And this is what happens to a human being who allows this life, dunya, materialism, to enter their hearts and take over. So the problem is not having things in the dunya. The problem isn't having money. The problem isn't having power. The problem isn't having status. The problem is when we start to worship these things. The problem is when these things take over our hearts. And when a person allows money, for example, to take over their hearts, it's like a boat that allows the ocean water to enter it. And we all know, as many of you said, what happened to the Titanic, right? It was supposed to be the unsinkable ship. It was supposed to be the greatest ship of its kind, of its time, right? And what happened to it? It went down in history as the ship that got owned by the ocean and drowned. And that's exactly what happens to us when we don't have the right relationship with dunya. When we allow the dunya to enter our hearts and take over. And when our love for dunya is so intense that we actually become slaves to the dunya. So there's a very famous saying of one of the companions. And what he said is, zuhud. Zuhud is a concept of detachment, not being too attached to this life. He said that detachment is not that you do not own anything. It is that nothing owns you. So you may, and there were many companions, they were very wealthy. They had money, but as the scholars say, their money was in their hand, not in their hearts. The problem is when money is in the heart, it poisons the heart. Just like the water of the ocean poisons the ship. And so these are concepts that we have to teach our children because yes, we live in a society that tells us to worship money, that tells us to worship status, to worship materialism.